And then they're like, it's a flip. They turn over the pocket queens. The opponent asks if we want to run it twice, and I'm like, forget this. Run it one time for the vlog.
Hey YouTube.
G'day poker people, welcome back to the vlog. It's 5 PM on a Friday afternoon, and that means I'm heading back to a Melbourne home game. It's the same one I've been going to the past few Friday evenings. It's usually a pretty good game, so I'm keen to get back in there and grind out a session. Something I wanted to address about sort of just my lifestyle in general. The past month or so, I have pretty much fully made the transition over from online poker back into these live poker games, and it has been great for the YouTube channel, definitely getting a lot of great content that people really do seem to enjoy, and also been running hot so far in most of these home games, so definitely can't complain at that. But the downside to grinding live poker is just the messed up sleep schedule it gives you. Most of these games are at night, and I'm used to waking up like early in the morning and then going to sleep pretty early, and the live poker late games have definitely messed with that sleep schedule, and the past week has actually been really bad. I'm sort of just getting like, 6 hours of sleep here, 4 hours of sleep here, just whenever I like feel tired and go to sleep, whenever I have the opportunity to. That's pretty unhealthy, and I actually think it has impacted my decision making the past few live sessions I've played, so we'll cut myself a bit of slack today if I don't quite make that A-grade performance, because I know it will be affected by my lack of sleep. Having said that though, still going to try and push through and make as many good decisions when I play poker as I possibly can. I'm probably going to start working the night shift, so to speak. I'll finish the home game at around like 4 AM, go home, sleep during most of the day, wake up around 3 PM, then go to the gym, and then head off to another home game. It's not ideal sleeping during the day. Ideally, I would like to get more sunshine, but it's definitely going to be a vast improvement to just sleeping whenever in terms of my mental faculties and overall health. So that's the plan before I head off and brave the Friday afternoon traffic in Melbourne. There are a few key things I want to focus on in this session specifically. Give my opponents credits for bluffs. The past few sessions I've sort of just been pretty liberal with the exploit folds and not giving my opponents as much credit for bluffs as I definitely should. And I think maybe I should even do it an exploit right call even more. I think with me being a vlogger and everyone at the game knowing I'm a vlogger and stuff, people have been pretty keen to like show bluffs to try and get on the vlog and stuff, and I think I really do have to anticipate that and give my opponents more credit for bluffs than I have been doing. So without any further ado, I can't stop avoiding this. I got to drive in the Melbourne traffic. Let's get to the game. So the game kicked off at about 8:30 PM and ran all the way until 6:30 AM. It's a 10-hour session, plenty of interesting hands to get into. The game did play as a 1-3 for about half of it, but there were a few people chucking on the straddle. So 1-3, 1-3-6, as well as some bomb pots and even a 1-3-6-12 hand. So without any further ado, let's get in the action. So very first interesting hand of the vlog, the double straddle is on, so it's 1-3-6-12, and the action folds to my button with King 7 of diamonds, open it up to 25, and then both the first straddle and second straddle call. So we're 3 ways to a flop of King 10-5 with 2 clubs, and the first straddle actually decides to lead out for 25, second straddle folds, so the action's on me here, and I do think there might be some merit to raising for value here, try and get called by like Queen Jack or a flush draw, but I do want some top pairs in my call down range, and I kind of like having a King with a 7 kicker to be one of those hands, just because Ace King and King Queen and maybe even King Jack, they're just going to make better raises when my opponent is leading out with top pair, just because we call that hand and we get a bit more value in that way. When I have a worse kicker with like I do with the 7 here, I think it's a good one to put in my call down range and give us a strong hand to call down with going forward. So I throw in the call and we're heads up to a turn, which is the 9 of clubs. Pretty gross turn, not only does Queen Jack get in, but so does the front door flush, and things get even grosser because the straddle decides to lead out all in for 250. Yikes, pretty gross spot for us here, and kind of want to just fold just because we do lose to so many flushes and Queen Jack. Having said that though, when we called with this hand on the flop, it was to have some strong call down hands in our range, and if we are raising on the flop with Ace King and King Queen, this is really one of the stronger hands we can have here. Potentially we could have Queen Jack or a flush ourselves, but if we're just defending with those hands, we're going to be over folding. I think I've mentioned this in the vlog before, but I kind of feel like people that I play in the games with knows that I make a vlog. I kind of feel like people have a target to try and bluff me off of hands because of that. And I think that might be a spot where the opponent's doing this. They could have the naked ace of clubs with like ace 9 offsuit with the ace of clubs that they let out with the backdoor nut flush draw to try and pull a move like this. So I do think it is a good spot to put my foot down and defend my range pretty heavily here, which is what I do. I throw in the call. They show the ace of clubs and say that I missed, so I just end up showing my king 7, then they muck their other cards. So raking in a pot to start this thing off, and happy to mix in a light call down to kick this thing off right. Next hand is just a straight 1-3, and I'm under the gun with ace-queen offsuit. I raise it up to 10. Then a short stack low jack, rips it all in for 100. The action gets round to a bit of a loosey-goosey small blind, and they throw in the call of the 100. The action's back on me now, and interesting spot because I am somewhat concerned that the small blind just cold calling the 100 when they have 300 behind could be a trap with aces or kings. I think it's a good spot to mix it in just because it's likely I'm going to 4-bet rip it just to try and isolate the all-in player. Do consider folding, to be honest. It's an awful price we're getting to call and could be behind both of the ranges we're up against, but I think 4-bet ripping it does make sense as well. The opponent who cold called the 3-bet shove, they could have aces or kings. They could also have jacks, 10s, ace jack, ace 10 suited, something like that. And we're pretty happy to get all in against that range when we do have ace queen. So I decide to rip it all in for the 300 effective, and then the small blind says something to the effect of, forget it, I'm already committed anyway. They end up throwing their chips in. The low jack shows ace king. We got the live run out there for you. And as you can see, we flop top pair with the queen, so we're going to crack the ace king. I end up showing my ace queen and the small blind mucks, so we end up raking in this pot. Still running hot in this session so far. Let's go. Next hand is a double board bomb pot, baby, and I'm on the button with queen 5 offsuit. I'm going to see 2 flops. I'll pop them up there, and you can see we've got pretty much nothing on flop 1, but we do have the nut flush draw as well as bottom pair on the second board. The action gets to a loose aggressive low jack who leads 30. Then the action folds to me, and I think this is a good spot to just call. Could go ahead and raise to try and bluff my opponent off like a weak hand that they're leading. The problem with that though is on a board like this, there's not that many like nutted hands that if my opponent does have, you know, ace X or like 2 pair on the second board, like there's nothing that's really going to scare them off. The only thing they would be like behind really is 9-7 or 9-3 of spades specifically, which is pretty unlikely. So I think it's a good spot to just call and try to draw to my nut flush draw, particularly getting a good price when my opponent bets less than a half of the pot. So I throw in the call. It heads up to 2 different turns. The first one's the 7 of spades. The second one's the 2 of hearts. So it doesn't really help us at all. But the opponent does check it over to me now. Now I really like going ahead and bluffing with this. We essentially have like no showdown value. I would rather go ahead and bluff, and I think betting here I could get my opponent off something like pretty much any single ace X on the second board, or maybe even 2 pair on the second board that has nothing on the first board. Might go ahead and fold here, and it's just a good spot to put pressure on. So I go ahead and bet 80. In retrospect, I could probably use an even larger bet size just to try and maximize fold equity. Even going like 130 would make sense. It's not what I did though. I made it 80, and then my opponent tanks a little bit before throwing in the call. So it heads up to 2 different rivers. First one's the 7 of hearts, putting out 3 7s, and the second one's the 8 of spades. So we do make a nut flush on the second board. When the opponent checks it over to me, I definitely want to go ahead and bet here. There's sort of like 2 different ways I could look at this. I could either go ahead and try and bet my nut flush for value, try and get called by like pocket jacks with a spade, maybe pocket 9s with a spade, something like that, 9x of spades, and I could use a small sizing to try and get paid off of that hand. But I actually think there's going to be more EV in using a really large bet size to try and bluff my opponent off a weak full house on the first board. For instance, if my opponent has pocket 8s with no spade, or you know, ace 9 with no spade, they're going to be pretty hard pressed off to call a really large bet. I think it's a good spot to try and put maximum pressure on, because I could have a hand like pocket queens with the queen of spades, pocket jacks with the jack of spades, and the opponent's going to be terrified to call off with those hands, and they only have 1 full house and they're only playing 1 board. So I decide to go for it. I overbet to 500, putting maximum pressure on my opponent's full houses. I will say though, this play might be a bit face up. I think it's a good spot to go for it and try and get them off a full house. I made it 500, and then the opponent is in the tank for probably a good solid 45 seconds before sighing and mucking their hand. So we're going to rake in this pot almost positive. We were behind on the first board with queen high. Very happy to rake this one in. Next hand is just another straight 1-3 and a short stack cutoff goes ahead and open limps. Now I'm in the small blind with my favourite hand in all of poker, pocket aces. I go ahead and raise it up to 20, which honestly might be a bit small in the live 1-3 game, but whatever the case, I went ahead and made it 20. I get a call from a tight aggressive big blind and then the limper calls as well. So we're 3 ways to a flop. Jack 8-5 rainbow. The action's on me, and I think this is a good spot to go ahead and check out of position to 2 different opponents. I don't hate if someone told me that they led here. Obviously you can get a lot of value with pocket aces, but just that we're out of position to 2 people, probably a better spot to go ahead and let them bet off worse hands. So that's what I do. I check it, then the big blind checks, the cutoff goes ahead and bets 40. Now the action's back on me, and some merit to check raising all in here, but I think I prefer calling just because it's more likely when we just call that we get an overcall from the big blind when they do have 1 pair, and it just increases the pot when we have a hand this strong, which if we check raise here, probably just folding everything. So maybe this is me getting a bit greedy, and there is some merit to denying equity if the big blind wants to call with like 9-8 or something, but getting greedy here, I throw in the call, but the big blind ends up folding anyway. So we're heads up to the turn, which is the 6 of spades. I check it over to the cutoff, and then they go ahead and rip it all in for about 90. Easiest snap call in the world for me. The opponent ends up showing King Jack offsuit, so we're ahead here. We're off to the river, which is the Queen of Hearts, so we hold against King Jack and raking in yet another pot. Damn, we're running hot so far. Next hand up, the straddle's on, and I'm under the gun with ace-10 offsuit, and I decide to raise it up for 15. This is a pretty loose open under the gun in a straddle pot, so probably a mistake to open it, but I did anyway. Guess I got a bit impatient playing live poker. I made it 15, and then the team man's back. He calls in the cutoff, as does the straddle. There were 3 different ways to a flop of ace-7-5 with 2 clubs. Straddle checks it over to me, and interesting whether we want to go ahead and bet or not. I think in this specific dynamic with the team man and the straddle in the pot, probably is a bunch of value to go ahead and bet when I do have a hand as strong as top pair here. Having said that though, I do want some checks on this board, being that we're multi-way, and I think ace-10 might be one of the better ones to have as a strong hand I can check call with, and I decide to check call for that reason, but definitely merits betting out as well. Then T-Man goes ahead and bets 40. The straddle calls, and I kind of gave this away earlier, but I do end up calling here, check calling. So we're off to a turn, which is the 6 of clubs. Straddle checks it over to me, pretty bad turn. The front door flush gets in, so I go ahead and check it over to the T-man, and then he checks back really quickly. So we're still 3 ways to a river, which is the 4 of spades. The straddle checks it over to me. I'm really just trying to get to showdown at this point. Any 8 and any 3 make a straight, as well as the front door flush got in, so I lose to a bunch of stuff now, so I check it over to the T-man. He goes ahead and bears 112. The straddle folds. Pretty gross spot. I do give the T-man credit for a lot of ace-x hands. I know they're probably cold calling with like 8-4 offsuit in position, so there's definitely some stuff that they stabbed the flop with and then got scared by the turn when either of me or the straddle can have a flush, so they check back. I definitely do give them a lot of credit for 8x they could have in their range, but the thing is, if they're using that logic with 8x, they could probably be doing it with like Jack 10 offsuit, Jack 9 offsuit, and they're just stabbing because they know like the strongest hand I'm really going to have here is an ace-x, and like them betting it's going to put ace-x in a tough spot. So I want to defend with some of my ace-x. I'm going to put my foot down when I'm against the T-man. I throw in the call, and then they end up showing me 8-6 offsuit. So they did get there with a straight on the river, and we paid them off for probably the most we would have. Next hand's just a straight 3, and I'm on the button with pocket 8s. I go ahead and raise it up to 10, and then the big blind, who was the same villain from the King 7 of diamonds, they throw in the call. So it heads up to a flop of Jack 10-5 rainbow. The opponent checks it over to me, and with this hand, pretty eager to try and get showdown and very happy to see a free turn. So I check it back. We heads up to a turn, which is a pretty nice one. It's the 8 of diamonds, putting out backdoor diamonds. The opponent goes ahead and leads 20. Now the actions on me, definitely want to go ahead and raise here. And the good thing about raising here is we're representing a pretty narrow range. Like we could definitely have King 9, pocket 8s, but I think most of the hands that are really strong on this board, we're probably just going to bet on the flop. Like if we have pocket jack over pairs or Jack 10 suited, Jack 10 offsuit even opening the button. So a turn raise kind of looks suspicious with backdoor diamonds out there. So when we do have pocket 8s specifically, slam dunk spot to raise it up. I make it 60, and then the opponent tanks a little bit, before throwing in the call. So it heads up to a river, which is the 6 of hearts, and things get kind of funky because the big blind decides to lead out for 200. So they actually overbet lead. Pretty confused by what this means. I definitely think it's somewhat possible the opponent does have king 9. They're just leading out in case they're worried I'll check back pocket aces or something, I guess. Like, the opponent does inherently feel pretty polarized here. I mean, maybe their range could have like pocket 6s or 5-6 offsuit, and there is merit to raising for thin value. Whatever the case, and I decided to just call the 200, and then the opponent turns over 7-4 offsuit. So they did hit a gut shot and got there on the river. Very, very glad that I didn't end up raising their bet, but wonder if I could have a hero fold, because I just think that when they overbet to such a large amount, that it's sort of like they call with their gut shot on the turn, knowing that they get paid off if I got there. So I mean, the river's really interesting. I could see doing any 3 of the options, and I just called and got cooled pretty badly here. So GG to the villain. Another straight 1-3 hand. I'm in the cutoff with ace-8 offsuit. I open it up to 10. Then the T-man calls in the small blind. So it heads up to a flop of queen 9 with 2 hearts. The opponent checks it over to me. And interesting whether we want to go for value/equity denial here. I definitely think there's merit with ace high, just because I think the opponent might float with like jack 10 or hearts, and we just get a bit of thin value in that sense. But it's a showdown value type hand, so it would make sense to check back. So really could see going either way. I decided to bet in this instance. I went ahead and made it 10, and the opponent calls pretty quickly. So it heads up to a turn, which is a repeat 9, and then the small blind decides to lead out for 25. Definitely somewhat concerned my opponent could have a full house. I think they're going to lead a lot of their full houses, knowing that a lot of my hands are going to check back on this turn. So it makes sense, but they could have bluffs as well, stuff like jack 10 or flush draws, or maybe even something that got counterfeit like pocket 6s would make sense as just a pure bluff hand to try and get me off ace high. Can't be folding against that range just yet. I throw in the call. So it heads up to a river, which is a 6 of hearts. Definitely not the best river in the world. We do lose to the front door flush now. The opponent goes ahead and bets 50, so pretty gross spot. Do lose to any queen, any 9, or a flush. The 6 is kind of a bad river because it does block my opponent, like having called with pocket 6s and turned it into a bluff. So all of this kind of just makes me want to fold, and I do end up folding my hand. Maybe it's a mistake. We still do beat jack 10 and like king jack, and so if my opponent is choosing to use those as a bluffs, they got us on this hand. But I did lay down the ace high. Next up, we've got the Stratolon. It's 1-3-6, and the T-man open limps under the gun. Then a tight aggressive cutoff opens it up to 20, and I'm in the small blind with ace-king offsuit. I go ahead and 3-bet it to 80. T-man folds, and the cutoff goes ahead and 4-bets it to 220. The action folds back to me. The cutoff only has about 420 in their stack, and very happy to get ace-king offsuit all in for less than 100 straddles. That's what I do. I rip it all in for the 420. They sort of like and ah for maybe like a few seconds before throwing in their call, and then they're like, do you have aces or kings? And I'm like, no, I have ace king. And then they're like, it's a flip. They turn over the pocket queens. The opponent asks if we want to run it twice, and I'm like, forget this, run it one time for the vlog, let's go. We got the live run out. That is not a good flop for us or a good turn. Unfortunately, we don't get there, and maybe we should have run it twice because the opponent scooped us on just this one run out. Next up, we've got another straight, just 1-3, and I'm in the hijack with pocket jacks, open it up to 10. Then a tight aggressive cutoff goes ahead and 3-bets me to 30. The action falls back around to me, and in a hijack versus cutoff dynamic, I think it's pretty close whether you want to go ahead and 4-bet pocket jacks or not. I could say either just calling or 4-betting both seem like fine options, but I decide to just call here, and it's because I'm against a tight aggressive opponent who I think is going to have less 3-bet bluffs, so it makes sense to not try and inflate the pot too much. I throw in the call, and then we heads up to a flop of 10-10-7 with 2 clubs. I check it over to the opponent. They go ahead and c-bet 15. The action's on me now, and I think we have to just call here. My opponent did use a smaller sizing, so there might be some merit to check raising to sort of try and deny equity to like ace-king and ace-queen. Even like lighter 3-bets like king-queen. Like, we're pretty happy to deny equity to those hands with the check raise, but still concerned that my opponent has all the stronger overpairs in their range, and really don't want to try and inflate the pot out of position for that reason. So I do decide to just call. So we're off to a turn, which is the 8 of diamonds, putting out backdoor diamonds. I go ahead and check it over to the opponent again, and honestly, actually kind of like leading in this spot. The 8 does make any 9 an open-ended straight draw. So if my opponent does have pocket 9s or 8-9 suited, we can get called by those hands. Additionally, backdoor diamond, same story. But I talked about my opponent might be betting with like ace king or king queen. I said on the flop we could have check raised to try and deny equity. We could also lead the turn to try and deny equity. I think that makes sense here on this turn. So I sort of was just playing in flow and probably not quite on my A game because I didn't take the opportunity to lead. I checked it over to the opponent who checks back. So still heads up to a river, which is the third 10, giving us a full house. I think we want to go ahead and bet for value now. My opponent's going to have a lot of ace king and ace queen in their range. I want to try and get paid off by that hand. I think if my opponent did have an overpair, they're probably going to bet most of them on the turn. They might check back sometimes, concerned that I have like ace 10 suited or jack 10 suited, something like that. But I think most of the time they're just going to have an ace high hand. I really want to get value from that hand. So it's an interesting decision what size we want to bet here. Could size to something like 60, maybe giving my opponent a better price to call with one of those hands. Having said that though, I kind of like overbetting here. Just if I did have a bluff like ace jack with, backdoor diamond, something like that, I might go ahead and overbet here just to try and put my opponent's ace x hands in a tough spot. If I'm going to use that large sizing with a bluff, probably should be using it with a value hand as well, right? Pocket jack seems like a pretty clear value hand. So I go ahead and bet 150. Then my opponent snap calls, which is not good news. They ask if we have a 10. I show my jacks, and then they show pocket kings. So they're going to get us here. And maybe the overbet, I'm underestimating my opponent's propensity to check back over pairs on the turn. Maybe they don't have as many ace x as I thought. So maybe I own myself with the overbet on the river here. We've got one final interesting hand before we wrap this thing up, and the straddle's on, so it's a 1-3-6, and I'm on the button with king 8 offsuit. I go ahead and raise it up to 15. Bit loose, but I mean, we're on the button and we want to attack those blinds and straddles, so I made it 15. T-man calls in the big blind, as does the straddle. So we're 3 ways to a flop of ace 7 deuce with 2 clubs, including the ace of clubs, and T-man actually decides to lead out for 25. Straddle folds. The action's back on me here, and I think we have a pretty clear call here. Not only do we have a bit of showdown value with our king high, but we have the backdoor nut flush draw, and we're playing over 1.5k effective here, so definitely going to throw in the call. We're heads up to a turn, which is the 2 of clubs, repeating the deuce, but giving us a nut flush draw. The opponent keeps betting at it. I go ahead and make it 75. Interesting spot, whether we want to raise or just call here. Definitely not going to go ahead and fold with our nut flush draw in position. I could go ahead and raise here to try and target my opponent's weaker ace x hands, like if they led with, ace 5 of hearts, something like that. It's going to put them in a tough spot with a raise. Having said that though, there is merit to calling, and I think it's because if I have the nut flush here, I probably would just call. If you look at how solvers play turn flushes and stuff like that, they really do like to play them passive, just because it's going to be kind of like face up when you do raise, and you really want to protect that calling range, since the equity is between the ranges of like flushes versus other flushes is like pretty close. So I do decide to just call here with a nut flush draw, and then we're off to the river, which is the 10 of spades. So we do whiff with our flush draw. The opponent goes ahead and bets 175. I was about to say I take calling off the table, but there is some chance we're still ahead with king high if my opponent's just going like crazy with 5-6 of diamonds or something like that. Like, we do beat pure bluffs with just king high, but I don't think that's the play. I think we're better off either raising or folding. Still concerned the opponent could have ace x or a flush, or maybe even deuce x, but I really think it is likely that they do have a lot of bluffs in their hands, and they still got like weaker ace x hands that they're going for thin value with, and I think raising here is going to pretty adequately represent a flush or a full house. And we know the opponent can't have the nut flush with our king blocker, so I think it's a great spot to go ahead and bluff raise. I go ahead and make it 425, and then my opponent pretty much snap folds. So absolutely stoked to get this bluff through, but the fact my opponent folded so quickly, it's a decent chance king high was actually already ahead. So those were the most interesting hands we played across the session. In terms of how I feel about my play, I'm going to go with a B+ for today's gameplay grade. Really liked a lot of the things I did in this session. I thought I was ranging my opponents pretty well and giving them, credit for bluffs, credit for value hands in good spots, and sort of adjusting pretty well. And also did play for 10 hours. I really struggle to play poker well for 10 hours. There are definitely some mistakes that we'll get to, but I wasn't playing egregiously like I typically do after the 6-hour mark. I really felt like I held it together and played better than I usually do when I've been playing that long. So that's a lot of progress, and I'm absolutely stoked with that. Can't quite go to the A grade level yet. I think the overbet with the pocket jacks is probably a significant mistake, and the chances that I value on myself there, pretty likely. So I think the overbet, pretty egregious error in all honesty. And then calling with the ace-10 multi-way, probably too loose in all honesty. I do lose to a lot there. Maybe I'm overestimating the opponent's potential to bluff when they did check the turn and there's still two people to act. So yeah, pretty key mistakes there that did cost me a lot of EV. But besides that, really like some of my plays. I think the call down with King 7 made a lot of sense and was really good. I like the bluff line I took with the King 8 offsuit. Though I will say my openings this session were a bit loose and not exactly sticking to the script. So I have to downgrade myself for that a little bit too, but not going to be too harsh with the critiques. I think overall, especially for a 10-hour session, I was absolutely stoked with my performance. I'm going to go to a B+ for today. In terms of how I ran during the session, ran about as well as I played in my opinion. Bought into the game for 1,300, ended up cashing out for 1,700 after I gave the dealer a nice little tip. So pretty big win on the session. I'll definitely take it. That's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you for sticking all the way to the end of the vlog. That really helps my channel's analytics and I do appreciate it. If you haven't already, hop down below, leave me a comment on how you will play those individual hand histories. Particularly interested how you will play the pocket jacks hand where I overbet the river. Would you use a different bet sizing, or would you even consider checking to potentially induce bluffs? Let me know in the comments below. But for now, I'm out of here. Peace.